Russia-Ukraine war that is now in its 8th month is entering a very dangerous phase of escalation. No less than President Joe Biden himself went on global television to state that nuclear Armageddon was now possible, and a nuclear war is a war that cannot be won and therefore should never be fought. So there are all the chances of the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and quite obviously the world economy is suffering enormously. A recession has been forecast from next year, a severe recession coupled with stagflation. There is energy inflation, there is food inflation, fertilizer inflation, and there is a disaster that is heading for most global economies. So it is now imperative that we take a look at this war as to how it has progressed and where is it likely to go. This war can be studied in 4 phases. The first phase that began on 24th of February this year, when the Russians launched what Putin called his special operation in Ukraine with the twin objectives of denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. Now, the term denazification was a bit ambiguous and it was interpreted by many to assume regime change. The second fact was demilitarization, which it now seems apparent the Russians wanted to do by destroying the Ukrainian military infrastructure and war waging capability. It must be pointed out that Russia has more or less destroyed all the original Ukrainian military equipment, their tanks, their aeroplanes, their missiles, etc., their armored personnel carriers, their artillery, guns, mostly which they had started the war with, have been destroyed. What we are seeing is Ukraine now resuming the fight totally with new formations, equipped with American and NATO weapons. Large scale supply of American and NATO weapons, unprecedented, more than $40 billion plus of arms aid has been poured into Ukraine already. So the fact of the matter is that when phase 1 started, the general assumption was that this war would be over maximum in 1 week or 2 at the very most. Nobody actually expected it to go for more than a few days. And that was premised upon the classical Russian way of war fighting. The way Russia had fought World War II, the way Russia has fought thereafter in Syria, in Chechnya, in Afghanistan, etc. They have used very heavy levels of fire and mass, not just fire and fire superiority, but manpower in the mass. So it was anticipated that Russia absolutely outnumbered. Russia's army was close to 1 million men in arms and a standing army of 900,000 more or less. And apart from that, the equipment stockpiles from the Soviet era, 50,000 tanks. So it was thought that this would be a walkover for the Russians. But amazingly, the Russians did not fight in the classical Soviet or the Russian way of war. They violated their own norms of war. Russia did not mobilize before the war. The entire force, that the contingent of Russian forces in Ukraine, never crossed 150,000, and more or less it was below this threshold. The Ukrainians had 250,000 troops to start with, and then they mobilized. They ordered complete mobilization all men from 16 to 60 were mobilized. So, as such, Ukraine today has almost 700 to 750,000 men in uniform. All of them may not be armed to standard fighting capabilities, but at least 3 to 4 lakhs of them are fully armed and have taken to the field against Russia. The standard numerical superiority required for an attack minimum is 1:3. For every one defender, you have to have 3 attackers. If you are going to fight in the mountains or the built up area, then I am afraid you need 5:1 and more superiority if you want to prevail. That is a standard maxim of warfare which has never been violated in the past. But here one was amazed to see Putin insisting that the war would have to be done with this limited force level. Why was this? I mean, on what presumption was this whole plan based, which defied military common sense and logic? Even the Americans had anticipated that Russia would just steamroll over Ukraine. It would be over in a matter of days, if not weeks. And they were equipping Ukraine to fight a guerrilla war. They were giving them anti-tank missiles, anti-tank shoulder-fired weapons, stingers, like they had supplied to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. They had anticipated that Russia would steamroll the whole of Ukraine in a matter of days, and then they would wage relentless guerrilla warfare to do another Afghanistan on the Russian forces. But Putin decided to go with just 150,000 men. Now, why was that? We feel that there is an apparent tension between the General Gerasimov hybrid war doctrine, which Russia has adopted from a decade plus, ever since the problem started in Georgia and then Ukraine. And this hybrid warfare doctrine, wanted to combine the elements of hard power, soft power, and not without waging full-scale war. They wanted to achieve their objective. This is the Gerasimov doctrine of hybrid warfare, or what they call the whole of government warfare. This is quite opposed to the standard Russian way of war fighting, which believes in mass and scale. They use a first echelon. When that first echelon is 70% destroyed, they throw in the second echelon, then a third echelon, and then they have operational maneuver groups to exploit the successes gained. This has been seen in World War II, in all the battles from 1943 especially onwards. I mean, the total reliance on mass and scale, unprecedented scale of artillery, unprecedented scale of manpower. They just wear the enemy down. So, had the Russians fought by their standard playbook, they would have mobilized before they started the war. As we have seen, Russia has been forced to mobilize almost in the 7th month of the war. After 7 months, Russia has been forced into mobilization because it just made no mathematical sense. 150,000 attackers taking on almost 3 to 400,000 Ukrainian defenders, and increasing by the day. It is to the Russians' credit that because of their technological superiority, they have been able to destroy, as I said, all the original Ukrainian military equipment. But did they cater for the fact that America and NATO would set up a pipeline to replenish every single loss for their T-64, T-68 and T-72 tanks that were destroyed? The Poles and the Serbs and the others, they gave them their T-72 tanks. The Americans gave them M113 APCs. The Australians and the others gave their Bushmasters. The British gave their equipment, and a hodgepodge of artillery from all countries of Europe and from America, M777s and HIMARS later. I mean, they were all supplied to Ukraine, and Ukraine, there is a new Ukrainian army now fighting the Russians. So, quite obviously there was some miscalculation on the part of the Russians, and that is pretty serious. It has had serious repercussions for the Russian campaign. Economy is all very good, but when a nation's prestige is concerned, when a nation's prestige is put on the line, you can't afford to economize. And that Russia has had to, forced to now make recompense for common sense, military common sense, and they have ordered partial mobilization. There were political problems for Putin in full mobilization, and therefore he has taken a halfway solution of partial mobilization. He has called up 300,000 military reservists. He has not called up conscripts from the general population. He has called up 300,000 military reservists. I mean, by military logic, this should have been done the day they started this war, and even earlier. But the fact that they held off mobilization for so long is an amazing fact, which is very inexplicable from the military evaluation point of view. Anyway, let's go on to how the war unfolded. Like I said, it has unfolded in 4 phases. Let me take phase 1. Phase 1 started on 24th of February this year, and generally you start phase operations like this with a SEAD campaign, suppression of enemy air defenses. Don't forget that in the Gulf War 1, this campaign had lasted over 42 days, and in Yugoslavia this had lasted 80 days plus. 80 days of a pure bombing campaign from the air to degrade enemy air defenses, enemy radars, enemy military, enemy tanks, enemy reserve formations, enemy artillery, all was degraded. 42 days in Gulf War 1 with 1,500 sorties per day. 1,500 sorties per day were launched in Gulf War 1. As compared to this, the Russian SEAD campaign lasted only 1 day. They hit about 14 airfields and they hit a number of radar installations, and they claim to have put down Ukrainian radars and their air defenses. But the Ukrainians were prepared for this. They had dispersed their air defense assets. They had even sent some of them to western Ukraine, other they had sent off to neighboring countries, and they survived intact. Most of their air defense equipment survived, and on later days they were able to inflict casualties on Russian air power. So this was the first inexplicable conundrums of this war, that why did the Russians go only for 1 day of SEAD? So the answer to this is 2 factors. One is a obvious intelligence failure of a catastrophic order on the part of the Russians. They were not informed, and I can't understand how it could have happened, that the Ukrainian military capability had undergone a paradigm shift since 2014, when they had to give over a walkover in Crimea because they were in just no shape to fight. Had Putin overrun the whole or this whole eastern part of Ukraine, then he could have gotten away with it. But then Ukrainian identity has hardened. Ukraine has been built up militarily by the United States, by Europe combined, to a combat hardened army which has now fought non-stop for 7 years in Donbas. It has become a combat hardened army. So the fact of the matter is, why was this, it is surprising why this was not taken into calculation. The second is a blind spot, not just with Putin, but with the entire Russian hierarchy going down to the last Russian soldier. There was this feeling, that genuine feeling, not propaganda but genuine feeling, that the Ukrainians are our Slav brothers, they are Orthodox Christians, and we will not use indiscriminate force against them. And therefore Putin had strictly ordered his forces to ensure that collateral damage was reduced to the minimum possible. Collateral damage was curtailed, and in that the classical Russian way of attacking especially cities with heavy artillery bombardments, 50,000 rounds of artillery per day and more. They have used that in Grozny, they have used that in Aleppo, they have used it in so many other places where they have fought post-war. That was curtailed. We saw no use in phase 1, especially in the north and northeast, in Kyiv and the Kharkiv sectors, very little use of Russian artillery firepower. On the contrary, it was the Ukrainians that used their artillery very effectively to beat back the Russian attacks. So, they started operations on multiple thrust lines. There were two main thrust lines that came towards Kyiv, the capital city, from the area of Belarus. Then there was major thrust line towards Kharkiv, there were two of them, and then the Russians attacked in the Donbas. It may be recalled that Donbas, they had prepared defences for 7 years. These were the toughest defences, these were almost like a Maginot Line, very difficult to take and very costly to take. So, progress here was likely to be slow. The fourth sector was the southern sector from Crimea. They had attacked from Crimea and they had attacked downwards from Donbas. The aim was to get a land link to Crimea via Mariupol, that land link corridor, and the aim was to give depth to their territory, their Sevastopol seaport, their major naval base in Crimea. They wanted to give it depth by occupying territory up till Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. They wanted to go even further, but it was here. The place where the Russians made the fastest progress was in the southern sector. Dvornikov was the Russian general here who had fought in Syria, and he was the only general who disregarded Putin's orders for ensuring no collateral damage, restraining fire assaults, etc., etc. He went, fought the classical Russian way. He is the only general who made the best progress in this war. The Russians, as I said, launched the attack towards Kyiv, the capital city. On the first day itself, they had an air assault, that is with their Mi-28 assault helicopters, Hokum assault helicopters. They attacked the Hostomel air base with the 331 Guards Airborne Regiment. Classically, when you you seize an airhead, you first expand the airhead to make sure no enemy artillery or enemy Stinger missiles can interfere with the landing of your own follow-up aircraft. We were surprised when this was not done, and on the second day itself, without any major artillery support, without any softening up of the defences of Kyiv, these people just launched the attack, and simultaneously President Putin went on national television to ask Ukraine to surrender. So, it is quite, it can be now put together in hindsight that they had been provided intelligence that possibly the Ukrainians would just fold up and surrender. But I am sorry, you don't base a military plan on the anchor premise that the enemy will not fight and will lay down his arms. That may be plan B, that may be your good luck. But you will have to ensure that you have devised a plan A or plan B to see that if that does not happen, then what do you do? But apparently there was no plan B. The paratroopers went charging towards Kyiv, and I am sorry, some of the best Russian special forces, they took the heaviest losses along with the Chechens. Russia realized that Kyiv was very strongly defended. The Ukrainian plan was to not fight on the border, but to draw the enemy in and fight in their cities and towns. Now, this is sound military policy, but it causes untold devastation to your city's civilian infrastructure and military infrastructure. In any case, the Russians attacked, and now the Russians, when they found their air assault had failed, they launched 4 thrust line to converge onto Kyiv from the direction of Kyiv, Chernobyl, and from the side of Kharkiv 2 more thrust lines. There was one long, thrust line on the main highway. Remember, by that time the spring thaw had started and the snow had melted and the ground had turned into slush and mud. Therefore, the Russian tanks could only move on the asphalt highways. Now that restricts the. Now when tanks cannot move cross country, I mean their cross country mobility is totally zilch. If they come along a main highway, I am afraid this can be picked up by UAVs, satellites, every known implement of reconnaissance can pick up the length of a long 64-kilometer long column on one of the roads, and that road passed through dense forest. Now in that dense forest the Ukrainians put their javelin teams, their tow anti-tank hunting parties, and they caused severe losses, fairly heavy losses, I won't call them severe, but fairly heavy losses to the Russian armor, and the bulk of the losses were caused by the Ukrainian medium artillery, which pounded these tank columns. They tried to take Kyiv, they found it too strongly defended, and you can fight in a city for months together. We all know what happened in Stalingrad, in Leningrad, we all know what happened in Jaffna, we all know what happened in Basra and Baghdad. So you can fight for months in a built up area of a city, which lends itself to protracted siege operations and defense. So the Russians next decided that they would not assault Kyiv, but they would surround it and pound it from artillery and try and force it into surrender. Now even that they were able to surround Kyiv from all sides, Irpin, Bucha, Hostomel, etc. A very tight ring around they made around Kyiv, but when they probed they found it was too strongly defended, and if they had pressed on with their attack they would have suffered very heavy casualties. So at this stage the Russians suddenly decided to call off their operations towards Kyiv and Kharkiv at the end of phase 1. Phase 2. The Russians made a clean break, and it is to their credit that they were able to get a clean break in a fighting situation around Kyiv and Kharkiv, and they were able to withdraw unmolested and intact. This is not what they could do from Kharkiv now. They were able to withdraw unmolested and absolutely unhindered from Kyiv and Kharkiv and redeploy their forces towards the Donbas. Russia now announced that its key interest areas were the Russian-speaking provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, and of course the land link to Crimea. It had already secured Kherson by then, which was the first city to fall in phase 1 itself, and now it was fighting hard in Mariupol. In phase 2, the Russians fought a very bitter battle. It took them over a month to fight street by street in Mariupol, the port city of Mariupol, and capture the whole of Mariupol. And then they simultaneously they attacked Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And after very intense and very heavy fighting, because please don't forget this was the heavily built up area. 7 years the Ukrainians had been preparing defenses here. They was in triple tiers, and every single village had been turned into a strong point. Every town was a fortress. Every city was an absolute fortress. And the Russians had to fight very hard, pay a very heavy price. But the Russians now used their standard tactics of massing heavy artillery, bombarding the place till they had reduced it to rubble. And the standard Russian technique of taking a city is to bombard it, to surround it from all sides, to leave certain designated corridors and tell the civilians to get out, evacuate from those, and then fire assault the city heavily. And after the fire assault, their tanks charge in to the city center, and then they, having taken the city center, radiate outwards. This is how the standard technique of Russian city taking doctrine as seen in Chechnya was now the rule book was applied here. 50,000 rounds a day they fired on Severodonetsk. 50,000 rounds a day, artillery rounds a day on Lysychansk. And then they surrounded from 3 sides Lysychansk, and they when they were trying to cut off the retreat from Severodonetsk. They captured. Lysychansk is on a high ground just across the river from Severodonetsk, and about almost 3 brigades, a Ukrainian division was fighting here, where a brigade plus was fighting in Severodonetsk. Now people thought that they would put up an even better fight, but the Russians now decided to approach it from 3 sides and try and cut it off. To avoid being cut off and to not lose all their troops, the Ukrainians withdrew from there. The Russians now gave a tactical pause, because by that time they had captured Mariupol, established the land link to Crimea, they had captured Kherson, they had captured the whole of the southern provinces till the nuclear plant in Kharkov was under their control. They had captured about 60 to 70% of Donetsk, and now they had captured the whole of Luhansk, 100%, right. So they felt that they had achieved their basic aims, so they gave a tactical pause to give their troops some rest and to fresh up. In the meantime, the Americans and the NATO, they had almost rebuilt the Ukrainian armies. Fresh Ukrainian formations which had survived, which had been raised later, were sent for training in UK, in Germany, in Poland and other places, re-equipped and brought in freshly equipped troops with Polish T-72 tanks, American APCs, Australian Bushmasters, etc., etc., American M777 artillery, medium artillery, and the HIMARS rockets, 16 of which were given. Now the Americans made a lot of propaganda broadcast to the effect that it is the HIMARS which were a game-changing factor. They had first said it was the Javelin and the TOW anti-tank missiles and the Stingers. Now they said the single game-changing factor, the single war-winning factor is the HIMARS. The Russians pointed out that 16 HIMARS are too few to change the course of such a major battle. But the actual fact was, by that time Ukraine began to advertise that it was going to launch a major counter-offensive in Kherson and take back Kherson and take back Crimea as their main objectives. So the Russians decided that what this war has shown so far is that offense has once again claimed supremacy over the defensive operations. Defensive operations inflict far more casualties on an attacker than vice versa, and therefore it is proving to be the more decisive form of war. So the Russians decided that if the Ukrainians wanted to attack, this was an ideal opportunity for them to inflict heavy casualties. So they stopped the attack, the further attack in Donetsk, and they pushed about 20,000 of their troops from Donetsk to the province of Kherson, where the Ukrainian attack was anticipated. It was this that delayed the Russian attack by a month, and Russian offensive in Donetsk area by over a month, and not the HIMARS by themselves. Yes, the HIMARS played a part in taking out certain key bridges and hitting some ammunition storage installations, which caused delays, but they did not disrupt the entire offensive. Now, this much heralded Ukrainian offensive in phase 3 started in the province of Kherson in the month of August. The Russians saw the build-up of this. They had already moved their reserve formations there. They saw the build-up of this. This was picked up by Russian UAVs, and then it was heavily engaged by the Russian artillery. Very heavy casualties were caused, and when these attacks were initially launched, they did not make much headway, only shallow penetrations. The Russians counterattacked in a number of areas, and they caused very heavy losses in men and material. But however, the Ukrainians kept pressing, but by the end of the month it was quite clear that this attack had then largely petered out. It was at this stage that the Russians decided to resume their offensive in the Donbas and go for the town of Bakhmut, and then from there press forward to their depth areas of Krementovsk, and then from there press to their depth areas. Now, For this, they now had already shifted their reserves to Kherson. So, they decided to pull out reserves from Kharkiv, the sector of Kharkiv, right, and pull it down to resume the attack on Donetsk. When they ordered this pull out of troops from Kharkiv and their withdrawal back to the line of the Oskil river, which shortened their front by almost 100 kilometers, and it was a logical decision to move them back. But this move back was picked up by the American spy satellites and the UAVs, etc., and the Americans straight away asked the Ukrainians to quickly launch an attack in this sector, even as the Russians were withdrawing to the Oskil river. So, the Ukrainians, to their credit, very rapidly pulled out 3 brigades. Don't forget, they had used 5 brigades to attack Kherson. They pulled out 3 brigades plus and they attacked in the Kharkiv very rapidly. Now, because the Russians were already withdrawing from here, it created absolute confusion in the Russian camp. They were on the withdrawal when they were attacked in hot pursuit, and quite obviously the Ukrainians made very rapid advance of almost 60 kilometers in a week plus, and they reached the Oskil river, and on paper it looked like a huge victory. There are some sources which are claiming that after April, when they had captured more or less the bulk of the 4 provinces that they wanted to keep, the Russians had pulled away most of their regular troops and they had left the fighting to their militias of the Chechens, the Cossacks and the Wagner group. There is a school of thought that the Russians had by end April, more or less start of phase 2, phase 3, I mean by that time they had pulled out most of their main fighting Russian army formations, and they had left the area because only the area had now to be held and secured against Ukrainian counterattacks, and they had given that task to their militias, the Chechen militia, the Cossack militia, the Wagner group, the Donetsk and the Luhansk militias. It was a conscious decision to give it to their second grade troops and to give rest to their main Russian army formations. Whatever it was, the offensive in the in Kharkiv succeeded brilliantly on paper. It hit the thin air and they just kept going. And for a time even the US and NATO were worried that they were not walking into a trap, but the fact was that the Russians were withdrawing and they had been caught in the act of withdrawing with their feet up in the air. So, despite that, I mean they have still managed to retain some good order and military discipline. The line has stabilized on the line of the Oskil river. However, the Ukrainians now saw the gaps which were there. They turned south and they attacked Izium and they attacked Liman, which after token bit of resistance, the Russians withdrew because their plan was to reduce their front line to defend. They wanted to defend only the area that was critical to them, which they wanted to retain. So, they had decided consciously to give up the Kharkiv area. Please don't forget that previously Kharkiv's importance stemmed from the fact that the railway lines etc. passed through Izium. With the capture of Sverdonetsk and Lysychansk, the Russians had developed alternative rail routes straight from the Donbas towards the front line. So, they felt they could now dispense with Kharkiv. But like they had managed a clean break in Kyiv and Kharkiv earlier, they were not given this clean break. The moment the American satellites picked it up, they realized that the Russians were juggling the same tired troops around from one sector to the other, and they told the Ukrainians to exploit it. The Ukrainians did, and the Russians suffered a needless, uncalled for, self-inflicted loss of face. Now, the simple fact is that by this time we were all wondering how the Russian army had managed to maintain its morale. You see, when you constantly recycle the same troops over and over again, you keep them shuttling from one sector to the other, you tire out your troops, and the best of troops after a few months, unless given rest and replenishment, will start cracking up. There is a saying, exhaustion makes cowards out of us all. So you can't really blame the performance of the Russian forces there. It is a miracle that they had held for 7 months, with such inferior numbers against a defender which was almost 2 to 3 times their number. But whatever it was, Putin was now required to make a concession to common sense, and his generals now thumped the table and asked for mobilization. It is understood that possibly there was a lot of discussion whether the mobilization should be partial or full, and ultimately in the month of September, Putin announced partial mobilization of 3 lakh reservists. He didn't ask for a full mobilization, conscription of Russian youth in the schools and colleges, or high school and colleges rather. He restricted it only to the reservists. It was a halfway measure, but it had to be done. And frankly, this should have been done much earlier. We are being told that this is the first time after the Second World War that the Russian army has mobilized like this. Incorrect. In 1968, the then Soviet army had ordered partial mobilization and called up 500,000, that is 500,000 troops for the attack on Czechoslovakia. And don't forget, within a week they had taken over the whole of Czechoslovakia. The various discussions were, how long would these reservists take to be effective on the battlefront? So everybody felt about 2 to 3 months of training would be required. I'm not very sure. If you go by the Czechoslovak model, the reservists then had been given minimal training and sent to relieve existing Russian formations of the main Russian army, which had moved from Eastern Germany to Czechoslovakia, and whereas the reservists had taken their place in East Germany. So if the Russians follow the same model, then they could possibly do this mobilization much earlier. That means the troops that would have to come in, and they are coming in batches of 50,000. Some are heading for Belarus, some are heading for the sector opposite Kharkiv, sectors opposite Donbas, and it is assumed that immediately after the autumn rains, which have now started, the autumn rains are now pouring in Ukraine, and that makes the rivers swollen and much wider to cross, much major obstacles. So after this is over and the ground hardens after this rains, which should be end October, earliest beginning November, mid-November, you can expect the Russian counter-offensive. They will not launch it in a hurry, they will do it in a very methodical and planned way, because they will like to make an impact. Now the simple fact of the matter is that Ukraine realized, or it was told by its American and NATO allies, who are providing it unprecedented intelligence support. This level of battlefield transparency has not been seen earlier. There were 75 military satellites and about 200 plus American and European satellites constantly monitoring the Ukraine battlefield. Every single tank, gun and soldier that moves is picked up and it is conveyed to the Ukrainians immediately. So the Americans have told the Ukrainians that there is a window they have of opportunity in which the mobilization is taking place, and in that they should try and resume attacks. And there is some anticipation that they might resume attacks. They have resumed attacks in Kherson. They are trying to start attacks in Zaporizhzhia, and possibly also try and push in the Donetsk area, right? So they are trying to maximize this, and as part of this, to incite Putin, to provoke Putin into prematurely launching his ground offensives, the Ukrainians attacked the Kerch Bridge. It is a vital strategic corridor that supplies Crimea. It is a prestige project which Putin himself had inaugurated as part of his integration of Crimea with the Russian Federation. Now they hit this bridge ostensibly with a truck bomb, which somehow a train was parked on top with fuel-laden rail wagons, and when this truck went up and set fire to the bridge on top. It was a meticulously planned so-called special forces operation. But there are some videos doing the round in which they have shown that under the cover of this truck-borne explosion, possibly 2 missiles also struck this bridge, this very strategic and vital bridge. Ukraine then went into a celebratory mode about how they had destroyed this bridge and how Crimea was about to fall. Putin was stung. By the time he had now chosen a new Air Force commander who had fought in Syria and who was known for his brutal tactics, he has carried out or ordered a massive barrage of Russian missiles and loitering suicide drones against Ukrainian infrastructure targets, Ukrainian command and control targets. They hit the headquarters of the Ukrainian equivalent of the CIA. That headquarters was destroyed. A number of the intelligence centers where the satellite imagery is interpreted and the move of Russian troops is shown to the Ukrainians, they were hit. They hit a number of their headquarters and communication centers. They hit power plants and water plants. They hit 11 cities in the whole of Ukraine, including Lviv and Chernobyl and the Chernihiv and a whole lot of other cities, including Kharkiv, including Zaporizhzhia, etc. And the power out, about 30% of the cities are without power now. Without water supply, fresh water supply, they have all been badly damaged. Some missiles did miss their targets and they hit road cross sections and some civilians, but the casualties of civilians were just 11. Considering that over 220 missiles and drones were fired, I think these show that by and large the Russian missiles have hit their targets, which is not civilians but was infrastructure of Ukraine. So this is phase 4, which will see a Russian counter-offensive. It is already started in terms of mass barrages of missile strikes on 11 Ukrainian cities, and this is the second consecutive day in which this bombardment has been going on. The Russians are also trying to gain time to properly organize the launch of their ground offensive and not do it in a hurried manner, but they will take their time over it. They will do it in a very methodical manner, as they are generally wont to do. So what is the way ahead? Where is it all going to lead to? In my assessment, we are heading for a major escalation of this conflict. Putin wanted a ceasefire. Putin said he had taken these 4 provinces, and now Putin ordered referenda in the provinces of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, which were vital, which he wanted for Russia's security and to liberate the so-called Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, which had been at the receiving end of Ukrainian xenophobia and nationalism. He ordered this referenda. The referendum was held and they have voted overwhelmingly for joining the Russian Federation. Of course, this is being questioned by the West, which are calling it sham referenda, but there it is. Legally, Russia has integrated these 4 provinces into the Russian Federation. They are treating this as sovereign Russian territory. And when that happens, when you go by the fact that these are considered by Russia as sovereign Russian territory, then as per Russian nuclear doctrine, if Russia is attacked, if it faces an existential threat, it reserves the right to first use of nuclear weapons. So are we looking for a nuclear Armageddon? No less a personage than the American president himself warned that a nuclear Armageddon, the world was facing a nuclear Armageddon as in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. 2 days later, he contradicted himself and said Russia would not use tactical nuclear ballistic missiles in Ukraine. The simple fact is, we agree with the second assessment because Russia will first exhaust its conventional military options and it has a lot of conventional firepower still left. Contrary to what is being said in the Western circles, in Western propaganda broadcast, Russia still has a lot up its sleeve in pure conventional terms. So, I feel that Russia will intensify its missile strikes, Russia will intensify its artillery fire assaults, its air strikes to the extent possible, given the highly adverse air superiority scenario, because Russia, for the reasons of the strength of the Ukrainian air defense, has not been able to use its air force in very large numbers. At the maximum, the Russian sortie rate has been 250 to 300 per day, and that also for very limited periods in the 8 months of this war. Their sortie generation rate has been very, very low. Just to give you an idea, the American sortie generation rate in Gulf War I was 1,500 sorties per day. Of course, that was not only the American Air Force, but the entire NATO air forces put together were attacking there. But their sortie generation rate was 1,500 sorties a day, compared to 250 to 300 sorties is nothing. But I have a feeling, and a lot of even American specialists are talking of the fact that even if they had been on the attack or on the air offensive part of it, even they would have had to restrain themselves in view of the highly lethal Russian air defenses. S-400, S-500 missiles, much better radars. The Russians also have stealth fighters. The Russians have a very good air defense system. So, in the face of such an air defense system, the only answer you have is stealth aircraft, and these are in limited numbers. So, even America and the NATO would have found the going tough for offensive operations, because what this war has shown is the ascendance of the defense over the offensive. The Russians have also learned this lesson, and they were also waiting deliberately for a Russian attack in Kherson and in Kharkiv. Of course, they hadn't really catered for it. They thought they would be able to withdraw unmolested. But the fact is they were caught in a fighting withdrawal, and that created problems for them. So, the fact of the matter is that Russia has still a lot of conventional cards up its sleeve. I have listed out a few. The major card is that when the 300,000 reservists are mobilized and the Russian formations, which have been given some rest since April, they are reused, Russia will be able to launch major offensives. Where will it launch them? I mean, some expectations or some speculations are that it might attack towards Odessa, it might attack Kyiv again, because the only way to force Ukraine to the negotiating table would be to put the Ukrainian leadership under serious risk. So, for that, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians go for Kyiv again, and they may not go for a full-scale capture, but like I said, surround and pound with artillery like they did with Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. So, this is likely to happen end October, beginning November, the moment it will depend on the Met, the moment the rain ceases, and the next window of opportunity they will get. They could even attack in winter. The Russians are known to fight in winter, and it is their strong point, but the Ukrainians are equally good. They belong to the same ethnic stock. So, I am not very sure. I think there would be a phase of exhaustion in winter, and both sides would like to lick their wounds and prepare for the spring round of fighting, but we are in it for the long haul. So, what was the motivation for the West? What exactly did they achieve by provoking Putin to fight this war, to launch this war? Let there be no doubt. Mearsheimer says, and Paul Kennedy says, a lot of American scholars and geostrategist thinkers, Henry Kissinger included, and they have been warning that America should not take on more than one major Asian power at a time. That means they should not take on Russia and China together, which is precisely what the Biden administration is doing by poking both Russia and China in the eye. So what was this calculation based on? On the face of it, it sounds irrational and extremely dangerous, because Russia and China are both nuclear armed powers, as is North Korea, right? And if they push them beyond a certain threshold, there is likely to be a nuclear exchange. And once a nuclear exchange starts, there is no telling how you could de-escalate. The world has no precedents for a full-on nuclear war. And it is lunacy and idiocy to try and push an antagonist to a level that he is forced into a use them or lose them syndrome. And he is left with no option but to hit out, and hit out massively. He may start with tactical nuclear weapons, local employment of tactical nuclear weapons. Americans are saying, we won't respond with tactical nuclear weapons, we will respond conventionally. But if he gets hit very hard conventionally, why would he not escalate up the nuclear ladder and give you more of the same? So I fail to see the logic. I fail to see where all this is being deliberately headed. And today Tulsi Gabbard has resigned from the Democratic Party because she says, and I tend to agree with her, that the democratic dispensation in the United States now seems intent upon warmongering. There seems to be a latent feeling in the US military that right now they have the military edge over Russia and over China, and it is to their advantage to push that advantage now and make both these countries fight and give them a setback that could last a few decades. There is a second school of thought which says, go back to how the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1991, the Soviet Union had collapsed without a single shot being fired. It just vanished into thin air, into an economic black hole. Now, how was that achieved? This was achieved by very meticulous planning by the Americans. Look, in 1973, the Arabs had weaponized oil and created the 1973 oil shock, which had caused a major recession and stagflation in the whole world. The whole developed world was facing economic ruination. So they decided to fight back. They took a lot of measures to reduce dependence on Middle Eastern oil. They switched to gas, they switched to nuclear, they switched to coal and all other things, and by these measures they were able to bring down the cost of oil quite a bit. That is the time the Americans, which had the Saudi Arabia then as a surrogate, which is a major difference now. Saudi Arabia was a virtual vassal state of the United States. They forced the Saudis to lower the price of oil, to flood the world with cheap oil, and to get the oil price crashing. In 1986, there was a phenomena called the oil glut. Unlike the oil shock, this was an oil glut. The world was flooded with cheap oil, and the price of oil fell from $30 a barrel to $10 a barrel in the space of 6 months. The Russian economy was predominantly premised upon the export of oil, and when this export collapsed, broke the back of the Soviet economy, and a nuclear armed state collapsed without firing a shot. It splintered into 15 smaller nations and the Russian Federation. So there is a school of thought that the Americans were inciting Putin to attack. They were pushing him constantly. They had promised after 91 that there would be not 1 inch expansion of NATO, but 14 countries have been added to NATO since then. Russia had declared its red lines were Georgia and Ukraine. When they moved into Georgia, there was a Russian reaction. They took the whole of Georgia in 4 days. 2014, they had the Orange Revolution in Kyiv. the Maidan revolution, and the Russians moved into Crimea, and they also simultaneously started a hybrid war in Donbas, that is the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. Had Russia moved then, it could possibly have taken over almost the whole of eastern Ukraine, because Ukraine was not focusing on its armed forces. The Ukrainian identity hadn't hardened till then, and they would have fallen very easily, like perhaps Georgia. But Russia missed that opportunity, and then the Americans began to arm the Ukrainians, and they started inciting the Ukrainians to attack and take back Donetsk and Luhansk, and possibly also Crimea, and to cause a larger war in which NATO would be involved. The Russians saw this coming threat, they decided to preempt it, and they said they had no option left but to attack first and preempt this Ukrainian offensive, when the initiative would be totally with the Ukrainians. To seize the initiative, the Russians were forced to attack first. So what was the intent of making the Russians attack first? That would give United States and the West an excuse to impose crippling economic sanctions. Crippling economic sanctions. And they felt that for a second time they could do to the Russian Federation what they had done to the Soviet Union. Collapse it without firing a shot. They say history repeats itself, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. Something quite like that has happened. The outcome of the military campaign will not be as crucial as the outcome of the economic war that both the sides are fighting. The Americans struck back. They $650 billion worth of Russian reserves, 300 billion plus was in American and European banks. They just froze that. Then they put crippling sanctions on the American export, the Russian export of oil and gas. And they have said that no gas would be bought. Europe, about 90% is dependent on the export of Russian gas, 60% on Russian oil and other products, petroleum products. It is not possible for Europe to de-link itself within the space of a year. Alternative infrastructure will create 4 to 5 years minimum to be put in place. So Europe started buying Russian gas on the sly, and the Russians said, if you want our gas or our oil, then you have to pay us in rubles. And in so doing, this was a master stroke. The ruble was in free fall. From 80 rubles to a dollar, it had gone to 160 rubles to a dollar, and then it has now come back to 60 rubles to a dollar. It is the best performing currency in the world against the dollar. It is the European economies that have been ruined. Inflation in the United States is the 40 years high. The price of oil has gone up to $5 a gallon. There is not only energy inflation, there is crippling food inflation. There are riots in the cities of Germany. And now that Russian gas is cut, and even the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was sabotaged. The Americans are saying the Russians did it, they are hinting the Russians did it. The Russians are saying it is Americans who have done it, and Biden had said before the war started that they could blow up this pipeline with that smirk. So the fact of the matter is that Europe is headed for a very harsh winter. Whether European unity will last this harsh winter in the face of stiff angry popular backlashes. Why should the Ukrainian interests be given primacy over their own? For how long are people going to suffer? The European populations. And those are all democracies. I don't think they are as impervious as an autocratic regime can be to public sentiment. So that is a big question mark, the way this economic war is headed. What is amazing is that at the same time, Nancy Pelosi decided to go to Taiwan. General Mark Milley, the United States Joint Chairman Chiefs of Staff, you see, he said it was not a particularly good idea. Nevertheless, Nancy Pelosi went, and after her, there has been a train of senior American visitors to Taiwan. China had threatened, bluff and bluster that they would take very stringent action, very severe action. They had warned of grave repercussions. But in the end, I think the Chinese bluff was called. China still postured very heavily. It sort of did a mock blockade of Taiwan, and it fired missiles across Taiwan. It created a lot of heat and fury, but in the end signifying nothing, because I think China has also learnt its lesson from the Ukraine conflict, that attack is a very costly proposition with modern technology in place. And an attack across 80 miles of the sea is going to be costlier still. So when will China attempt it? I don't think China will be hustled into attacking faster than it is ready, which the earliest is given as 2025. So is the United States then trying to push both these countries together? That is bizarre logic. I mean, whether you talk of Henry Kissinger, Professor Mearsheimer, George Kennedy and other American geopolitics pundits, they are all warning America not to take on China and Russia together. Nixon and Kissinger had broken the communist monolith bloc by splitting the communist bloc, by wooing China and taking it away out of the Russian bloc. So the same, lot of people were suggesting that if America really deems China as its main long-term threat, China has a 19 trillion economy. China is spending $293 billion a year. Russians are spending just $60 billion a year, less than what India is spending on its defense budget. So Russia is not a peer group competitor, China is. So why we were told that there is a pivot to Asia, that to the Indo-Pacific, they are all moving and they are prioritizing this theatre. But now everything is swung the way of Europe. So this seems to be just so much of hot air and talk. And Biden at one stage was then almost forced into provoking China, or by assurances that he would come to end the ambiguity over whether America will intervene when China attacks Taiwan. And he has made open statements. But the fact of this is, you are dealing with nuclear armed adversaries, and when you push them over the cliff, they are likely to retaliate with nuclear weapons. And once nuclear weapons are unleashed in a symmetric scenario, there is no model of how it could proceed. And how Biden hopes to stop a full-scale nuclear war, I am afraid that is now known only in the corridors of Washington, while the rest of the world will have to sweat it out. The rest of the world is suffering. This conflict must be ended at the earliest possible. But if the United States and Europe are determined to see that this conflict does not end, and they fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, they are also causing untold damage and severe consequences to the American, to the European economy and the global economy per se. It is poorer countries like Sri Lanka which has gone bust, Pakistan is about to go bust, so many other Afro-Asian states which are weak, they are facing severe food shortages, and they could go the Sri Lanka way, a lot of economies could collapse. This is not a happy scenario for this world. This conflict has to end, and it has to end as soon as possible. Will it? I am not sure, because Russia has now been provoked, its prestige is at stake, and quite obviously till it hits back, I don't think it is prepared to call it quits at this juncture. It was prepared to call it quits about a month and a half back, because it had largely secured what it wanted. And it has now ingested that, it has called it Russian territory, and if people want to cock a snook at it, if people want to rub Russian noses in the mud, well, there will be consequences. And all that the rest of the world has little option but to hope and pray for better sense to prevail. Thank you.